Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to this special edition of Energy Frontiers, proudly supported by the African Energy Chamber. I am Justina Okechukwu. The 2023 edition of the annual Intra-Africa Trade Fair, held in Cairo, Egypt, was the most talked about event of the continent this week, with over 35,000 visitors, 1,600 exhibitors, and $43 billion worth of investment and trade deals that were signed. Frontier Africa Reports was live on the ground of this biennial event, and we have highlights of some of the energy-focused conversations in this package. The gathering featured key leading African and international speakers, government officials, policymakers, development institutions, and a range of events dealing with African trade and investment for the realization of goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area. One of the key conversations at the 7-day biennial event was a panel moderated by Frontier Africa Reports CEO and Executive Editor Boason Omofaye. The panel highlighted major strategies needed to inspire a robust private capital inflow into the energy sector and how to navigate the pathway towards sustainable energy generation and transmission, including innovation, investment, and collective prosperity for Africa. Here is an excerpt.
My idea of energy transition is, first, we need a transition. But as Bokolo said, we need investments, so finance. So let's start on that side. But let me start from the Salim, the extreme end of the of the row in terms of the number of deals that your organization is closing recently. That Angola is working on about 4 different refineries, and you're involved in some of this project, as well as the Lake Turkana wind project in Kenya as well. So it looks like you've got your hands in a lot of projects on the African continent. Bring me up to speed in my audience as to what you're doing on the ground in those 2 countries to start with.
Sure. We've bought a stake in the largest wind farm in all of Africa, which is based in Kenya, Lake Turkana, which has arguably the best wind resource in the entire world, and it's an operating asset. But the idea is to put more megawatts in place at the same site to take more of that natural resource that Kenya is endowed with, and really grow that. At the moment, it's producing almost 20% of the country's electricity. And it's going to be, with the expansion, hopefully, the country will come even closer to being a 100% renewable country. I see gas as a transition fuel for the continent. And when I look at some of the data produced by people like IEA, International Energy Agency, even if Africa produces something like 90 BCM per annum from 2030, the amount of contribution to global emission goes from 3% to 3.5%. So I think for me, the key thing is to make sure that half the continent, which is still lacking access to electricity, gets it. And if it comes from gas, let's work on that.
We developed Owando Clean Energy as a response to what, again, we see is going to be Africa's journey over the next, we see 3 decades. The 2060 or 2050 target for most African countries still has 55% of that energy basket as gas. We will move from a 90% currently to 55%, and that 40% odd movement will be taken up by renewable energies. But to achieve that, Africa needs $80 trillion. Half our governments can't pay their civil service. So the fundamental point here is that context of that conversation needs to shift. There are certain truths. We believe that the energy transition for Africa must be Africa-centric. It must understand that gas and oil will take our people out of darkness, and I think that's the first thing. I don't think you can embark on anything in the future if you can't see, right? So we need to get out of darkness. We have to educate our people. The standards of prosperity need to improve. And largely, if you provide energy, whether it's electricity or indeed any other form of energy that allows for logistics and all the eco-development type activities to function creates prosperity. So we've got to do that. That is our responsibility.
Somebody said, how many more Afro-Exim banks do we need on the continent to be able to meet this challenge? That is why, in addition to what the bank is doing with its partners, the management of the bank and working on the sidelines with the African Producers Petroleum Organization, Appo, which is an 18-member state of African producing oil companies, have decided to create another multilateral agency, which is going to be focused on financing the energy requirements of the African and Caribbean people. So we are in the final stages of getting all the approvals. It is going to be an organization set up by treaty, the same way Africa-Exim Bank will be. It will have 3 classes of shareholders. The first class of shareholders will be all the African producing countries, national oil companies. Class B and C would be African investors and international investors from all walks of lives. The projected share capital of this company will be $5 billion. And we hope that we will go through the process of ratifying these establishment agreements and the charter and do the fundraising to commence operations by June 2024.
At the moment, we have a just below 40% access rate, electricity access rate in Africa. You take that point and put it to the side. And then you look at Africa as the biggest market for solar irradiation. We have the most abundance of renewable energy resources in Africa. You put that aside. And then you look at Africa as the biggest continent or the biggest resources in raw materials. Cobalt, lithium, manganese, chrome, the likes. And then you wonder to yourself, and not to mention that we also have significant amount of gas reserves. And then you say to yourself, why is it that a continent that is so blessed in human resources, in natural resources, in geopolitical resources, fails to have an energy access demand? And what we found at Genesis, having been deploying and developing projects over the last 2 decades, is it comes down to 2 things. First of all, we need infrastructure investment in Africa. To date, you have a country like Zambia, that 80% of its electricity is from hydropower. It's not base load. And then you have Zambia that is producing significant amount of copper, but they have no access to gas. Whereas Mozambique has significant access, significant resources in the gas. If we had a pipeline from Mozambique into the copper belt in Zambia, then we've got a conversation we're talking about, not only from a power generation perspective, but also from a mining perspective.
And when it comes to energy, there's no doubt that Chinese investment, Chinese lending, and I separate out lending and investment, has been going onto the continent, both on energy and in particular renewable energy and particularly hydro so far. The new area where Chinese firms are looking at is solar and wind. And it is very important, and Melissa was actually asking me why should we look at China for that? Most of the hydropower that Chinese firms have engaged in has not been financed by Chinese banks. The vast majority has been financed by our governments, but they have the expertise because they've got that scale. When we look at solar so far, and I do think solar potential is extremely important to be, we've talked a lot about oil and gas, fossil fuels, etc. I do think solar potential is extremely important to be really promoting. We have the largest potential across the world on solar. Our potential is higher than the rest of the world in pretty much every single African country compared to the rest of the world. But we have 12.6 gigawatts capacity. China has got almost 400 gigawatts capacity of solar. Europe, 200, but that's spread across lots of European countries. Japan itself has got 79. Japan, 100 times smaller than the continent, has got 79 gigs, and we have 12, almost 13. There is something that needs to be done, and we need scale. And the only partner that can do scale China and India to some degree, but China for sure.
Still on Energy Frontiers, we have more in the package from the high-profile gathering. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. Another key highlight of the IATF 2023 summit was a panel which focused on the investment opportunities in Africa's green minerals and mining industry, while unpacking the growing trend in the battery manufacturing sector. The panel shed light on recent advancements in pivotal areas like electric vehicles, lithium, and battery technologies, as well as the role of the West in shaping this dynamic sector to foster strong partnerships. Take a listen.
And so we know that the big operators, the Glencores of this world, are very active on the continent. But the Northvolts that were part of the presentation that Kwasi gave us, they're not making, or even the Teslas, they're not making big announcements on the continent. Why do you think that is?
I think it's this perceived risk associated with Africa. I feel this is something that we see all the time. We've been pitching to large family offices as well as private equity firms in the West. And some of them just do not have a mandate for Africa. It seems as if they class Africa as a black box, and I think that is the perceived geopolitical risk associated with it. Further to that, Northvolt, and given the fiscal incentives provided by the West and governments in the West, they are so busy developing gigafactories in their regions that they really don't have the capacity to look outside there. So I think those are the two fundamental issues as to why we're not seeing established battery manufacturers looking at Africa.
And what's the ticket size? I mean, how much are you looking for in terms of an investment? And who are you talking to? Are you talking to the DFIs to take that, to play that catalytic role, to bring more, to crowd in more investors?
Yes.
What's the strategy in terms of on the finance side?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I've had to pivot the strategy so many times based on these issues that you see with financiers. So firstly, to answer the question, the ticket size, roughly, if you're looking at cell manufacturing in terms of capital investment, it's roughly around $100 million per gigawatt hour. That drops as you build capacity and the larger the facility. So in a 5 gigawatt hour project, our capital raise at this point in time is $450 million. And secondly, the question in terms of how we are actually trying to do this, it's via very much a piecemeal approach. We've been approaching DFIs as well as I mentioned, private family offices as well as private equity. The issue that we found with DFIs is that there's significant bureaucracy associated with their processes. And from an international financing perspective, again, given the perceived risk of Africa, their preference is to actually have an international holding company, as I showed on my slides, so that they do not want to make the investment directly into the continent or into the country. They'd rather do this from an international perspective, and they feel that would de-risk their investment.
But for me, I think we need to have a plan for that. Manganese is a critical, and I saw the slide, and that's why I was actually looking at manganese being number 5 in terms of, we might not be there in terms of EVs, but we're actually very excited that even in 2050, we still be there. And one is looking at it from an EV point of view for today. I don't know what the technologies are, but as a miner, in mining, looking at a solar plant of 200 megawatts, I'm still struggling with battery storage solutions that can actually allow me to produce the 200 megawatts because I'm 400 meters from a transmission line that I would probably produce the solar, but battery storage solution so that I can actually form get a wheeling agreement with Eskom so that I can export what I don't use because my sinter plant probably will take 40. A total of the mine, the sinter plant, and the ore preparation plant is 75 megawatts. So I have enough energy to actually, sell or export. So it's all those things that I think we are excited about. And I'm happy that I'm the oldest, I think, in the panel, and therefore young people like you would be able to take over and actually come with cleaner technologies, even with energy being the biggest challenge. And when they spoke about technology, I looked at South Africa and saying, we're sitting with 400 years of coal in South Africa. And the debate, the jury is still out there, whether we can still continue to use coal, as it is still the cheapest form of energy. And with the challenges that we have of energy, we need people like you and Duma to actually look at cleaner technologies so that Africa can continue to use the coal that it has, because we have an abundance of coal in South Africa. And I'm defending that sitting here because I think Africa must actually use the cleanest form of energy. Whilst your environment is important, I want to repeat what I said in the other panel. Poverty eradication is critical.
In my view, we need to really have real conversations as a continent, especially maybe at AU level, and push regional collaboration and integration, because this is very key. And whatever it means, I'm not very sure, but I really think that it's important that we flip the priorities. We have two priorities in my view. You have a political agenda and you have an economic agenda. Currently, I think most, times we push the political agenda, in a bigger way than we push the economic agenda. And I think we need to flip that and focus on how do we collaborate for shared prosperity. How do countries work together to do projects together? We also need to probably, agree that, for this to happen, I think we also need to identify who are the players, that are critical in this whole process, for us to actualize, what we are trying to achieve. And then we must meaningfully engage, in all these conversations. How do we achieve this? We need to look at the process. Now, if we look at the value chain, we talked about the minerals, but in the value chain, we have also, the aspects, for instance, of clean energy. This is also very critical. I think it is estimated that 60% of the global, solar, resources are sitting within Africa. And, when this is harnessed, definitely it's going to improve the access to electricity in a big way and also reduce, the cost of generating, power. But we need to understand what's the process. How do we move? How do we decommission the fossil, fuels, and begin to ramp up, on the, renewables, to achieve what we want to achieve?
Our investment strategy in the beginning was to map out all the assets that we can find across the continent and then start engaging with them. The first approach we did was we went to the countries, went to the country offices, so all the departments of minerals and energy, etc. And what we got back was that the countries don't actually know what they have. They would give you a long list of all these names of assets, but when you start approaching and getting in touch with the people with these assets, you would find that they're very, very early stage. They just got a license, and they'd want to sell the license to you for $50,000, but the license has not been explored. They've not looked at any detail in it. They've not even picked up a rock and done a sample. So you start to realize that there's a gap, and what we believe that should have been done is that governments should have provided the early stage exploration, geophysics of your entire country, so that each country knows what assets they have. It would make it a lot easier for investors like us when we can come and find the particular assets. So from that strategy, we had to then shift, and our shift, we began looking at key individuals in these countries. We started accessing our network. We're fortunate enough that I've had an uncle and my father were in mining for a long time, so they could direct us to people who we could assist us through the network and finding the geologists who've been working on these assets through the years. And from that approach, we were then able to find some assets. So we found a couple of assets that we're very interested in. We're in negotiations with them, and we will soon begin capital raising to acquire them. And when we acquire these assets, we're not just acquiring mines, we're looking to acquire mines and build processing capacity on top of it, but not to a precursor stage, just a stage before, so sulfates. So nickel, we're targeting building out nickel sulfate, and we'll sell those products individually. And in time, the ultimate goal is then to move towards precursor once you've acquired enough nickel sulfate and copper hydroxide that would justify building out the facility.
And finally, Following a rigorous review of bids received by the Advisory Council of the IATF, Algeria has been selected to host the 4th Intra-African Trade Fair scheduled to take place in 2025. I hope you enjoyed this special package of Energy Frontiers, and we thank you for watching. Be sure to follow the program on Frontier Africa Reports website, like this video, subscribe to our YouTube, and follow us across all our social media handles as indicated on the screen. I am Justina Okechukwu, and I'll see you next time.